Understanding how state laws work is crucial if you want to promote a healthy leasing relationship from start to end. Alabama landlord-tenant laws include several guidelines that both landlords and tenants should always follow to comply with the law. And these laws vary from state to state. In fact, every rental case is different. However, every rental agreement should abide by their state's regulations to avoid problems. And in this case, we're going to be talking about Alabama landlord-tenant laws. Now, landlord-tenant laws involve several sections that explain how a lease should work for all parties involved. In the case of Alabama, the required guidelines are fairly flexible, which offers many opportunities for both landlords and tenants alike. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of how Alabama landlord-tenant laws work. However, if you need legal advice for your specific case, remember, I'm not an attorney, so please make sure to contact your local attorney to get the right legal information. Currently, yes, Alabama is considered a landlord-friendly state. This is because there aren't many provisions regarding what a landlord can or cannot do, which allows them to be more flexible within their contracts. On the other hand, the Alabama landlord-tenant law protects tenants from some specific matters, such as discrimination or harassment. All guidelines, rights, and other miscellaneous information are thoroughly explained in Alabama Code Title 35-9A. Now keep in mind that those are general rules, but each rental case may be different from one to the other. Overall, here's what a lease agreement usually includes according to the Alabama landlord-tenant law. Description of the leased premises, address of the unit, information about the parties involved in the lease, overview of landlord and tenant legal rights, rent payments, security deposits, conditions for terminating the lease, and the person responsible for regular maintenance and repairs on the property. To see an example of what a lease agreement in Alabama might look like, you can visit our forms page to view and edit example lease agreements. So Alabama landlord-tenant law states that both tenants and landlords must comply with a set of rules before beginning the lease term. This is to ensure that everything goes smoothly all the time. In essence, this section explains what the landlord and tenant can and cannot do during the tenancy. Alabama landlords have the legal right to collect rent payments, collect a security deposit to cover damages to the property, and seek out a formal eviction suit in the case that the tenant breaches the contract or landlord-tenant laws. Overall, landlords must give the tenant a rental unit that complies with local health and safety regulations, and additionally, Alabama landlords must also provide repairs to the leased property if they're requested by the tenant. These repairs must be done promptly to prevent any legal disputes with the tenant. Another requirement for landlords is to respect the tenant's rights at all times, which involves not disturbing them when they're using the property in peace. Now, as far as tenants go, according to Alabama law, tenants in Alabama have the right to seek a habitable unit that complies with local health and safety regulations. If the property requires any repairs, tenant rights allow them to request these services from the landlord. In these cases, the landlord must provide the service in a timely manner. Otherwise, tenants are allowed to pursue alternative action to fix the problem. In addition, tenants in Alabama must comply with the following guidelines throughout the entire tenancy period. They must maintain the premises in good repair, pay rent on time, make small repair services when needed, not disturb other neighbors and tenants, and clean the premises within 7 days' notice if the landlord requests it. As I said before, all the information you need to know on how to promote a legally healthy tenancy is in the Alabama Code, specifically in the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Section 35-9A. The clauses I'm about to mention are the most important ones to include in your lease agreement since they're also the foundation for both tenants and landlords. If you want a more in-depth explanation of landlord-tenant laws, make sure to do your research and check out the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Section 35-9A. Now, when it comes to rent, Alabama is a fairly flexible area. There are no rent control policies in Alabama landlord-tenant law, which means that Alabama landlords can really charge as much as they consider appropriate for rent. Keep in mind that unless stated otherwise in the agreement, tenants have to pay rent at the beginning of each month. If the landlord doesn't specify information regarding the cost of rent, tenants have to pay an amount equal to the fair market value of the premises. Alabama landlord-tenant law allows for landlords to charge a late fee if they want, but is not a legal requirement. If they do decide to include these fees in the agreement, they can really charge any amount that they want. Alabama landlords can raise rent without having to give their tenant any notice. However, it's often seen as good practice to come to an agreement with the tenant on rental notice policies. It's important to note that Alabama landlords cannot raise rent as a discriminatory measure since it goes against the Fair Housing Act and other landlord-tenant laws. Landlord-tenant laws in Alabama don't specify anything regarding grace periods for rent, so this means that landlords can charge their tenant late fees as soon as the rent is past due. In these cases, Alabama tenants must pay as soon as possible to avoid legal disputes. A security deposit is mainly used to cover expenses in the lease that hadn't been accounted for. This is things like unpaid rent or damages that exceed normal wear and tear. In the case of Alabama, the amount of the security deposit cannot be higher than the cost of 1 month rent. Aside from this 1 month deposit, landlords can also charge an additional amount to the deposit if the Alabama tenant plans to take a pet with them. Alabama landlords must return the security deposit to their tenant within 1 month of the tenant moving out of the property, although this period can be extended to 60 days. If the landlord fails to return the security deposit within these 60 days, the Alabama tenant could seek legal advice. Alabama landlord-tenant laws establish that the landlord can partially withhold the security deposit in the case that the tenant decide to withhold rent without reason or if they violated conditions of the lease. If this is the case, the landlord has 60 days to give the tenant an itemized list of deductions, and after these 60 days, the landlord might not be entitled to collect the deposit. At the time of making this video, landlords in Alabama do not have to pay any interest on the security deposit. According to Alabama landlord-tenant laws, an Alabama tenant may terminate the lease early if they want. However, they must provide a particular amount of notice depending on the type of tenancy. Here's a quick overview. Weekly leases need a 7-day notice, monthly leases need a 30-day notice, quarterly leases and yearly leases are not applicable. Alternatively, Alabama tenants can terminate the lease early for any of the following reasons: the rental unit doesn't comply with fair housing regulations, active military duty, or landlord harassment. Evictions work slightly different from a lease termination. In these cases, the landlord has the right to evict their tenant if one of the following apply: a breach of the lease with a 14-day notice to cure or quit. With a non-payment of rent, they need 7-day notice to either pay or quit. Or with criminal activity, they need a 7 days to quit notice. Keep in mind that tenant rights protect them against any kind of retaliation from their landlord, according to Alabama landlord-tenant laws. Landlord-tenant laws require every landlord to inform their tenant of any concentrations of lead-based paint in the rental if it was built before 1978. If the landlord fails to do so, they might be exposed to legal consequences. You can read more about this clause in the EPA's pamphlet. According to Alabama Landlord Code, landlords must provide the name and address of every person involved in the lease. So landlord-tenant laws are fairly easy to follow. Just keep in mind that you need to be compliant with every law in your local area if you want to keep a good leasing relationship at all times. Aside from complying with the law, you need to make sure that both tenants and landlords agree upon everything discussed in the lease. Alabama landlord-tenant laws establish that the landlord must give the tenant at least a 2-day written notice before they enter the property. However, the landlord can enter the property without any notice in the case of an emergency. Small claims court in Alabama can hear rental cases valued up to $6,000. These contracts usually have a 6-year statute of limitations. So federal law doesn't explain any specific information regarding the required provisions to change locks, but it's assumed that Alabama tenants have the right to change locks if they feel threatened by another person. However, it's also assumed that an Alabama tenant cannot change the locks without telling their landlord. According to Alabama landlord-tenant laws, the Alabama Code, and the Fair Housing Act, tenants are protected from any kind of discrimination based on their sex, religion, race, color, nationality, disability, and others. Now, I mentioned evictions earlier and don't think it's quite as simple as it sounded. It can be a confusing and costly process, so be sure to check out this video where I go in depth in the whole eviction process in Alabama. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.